Hey guys, it's Mathil here once again, and I wanted to go over the Development Manifesto, or this Balance in Path of Exile's Conquerors of the Atlas big write-up. Every league, they like to do a bit of a write-up about just a broad overview of things that are changing, the direction they're going in for a league, for a big patch, and this one is no exception. So I want to go over just everything, like kind of analyze it a bit, and just give my little 2 cents on everything that's happening here. So to start with, it is a bow and other ranged attack sort of league and rework. Like the other few leagues have had melee, spell, minion buffs, that sort of stuff. This will be largely a bow rework and buff, and for the most part they're just giving us a few new skills. A couple got reworked and a lot are getting numerical buffs. So all ranged attacks have been reviewed, with most receiving numerical adjustments, mostly buffs, and specific skills being changed mechanically have been already talked about. That's things like shrapnel shot into galvanic arrow, explosive arrow getting a pretty big rework, things like that. Certain skills have received significant damage increases if they were not seeing much use, especially if they were greatly affected by the following changes. So a lot of skills were just kind of not very used, especially in the bow market, and they got some pretty big adjustments. Something like Blast Rain, for example, isn't too popular, but might be after these changes. A number of bow uniques have been reviewed. We still don't believe that rare weapons and unique weapons have a fair balance between them, with multi-modded crafted rares and certain unique bows being far too common. We've made some changes to improve this, but are aiming to make further changes in the future. So multi-modding a rare is pretty much the way to go for most weapons in most builds and build types, and bows aren't really an exception. It is kind of a problem that it's just way too easy to get 1, maybe 2 really good mods and then finish off the item and get yourself something like 70-80% of a perfect item. So that's fine to potentially bring that down a bit, and as such bring up some unique bows. Some of them really are complete crap, and just you find the unique bow and you know that's shit. Or you might look at it and think, that's a really good bow, Neuro's Harp, and you might want to try and build around it, but whatever you do with it, the damage just seems to suck. And that could definitely be adjusted a bit, and maybe some bows are just a bit too good and too accessible, so maybe they'll make them a little bit rarer. You then have Mirage Archer has been used by almost every popular bow build since release, providing a sizable damage bonus, long-range auto-targeting, and the ability to deal damage while moving. To lower its power relative to other supports, Mirage Archer now has a lower range it can target enemies, and the damage of the Mirage has been lowered slightly. So the damage being lowered slightly won't matter at all. It will still be used as a sort of damage while moving skill or support, and I think absolutely still be able to clear packs and increase your clear speed quite substantially. The range being toned down is probably the important part of the thing, but that's probably not a big issue anyway. It hits pretty far at the moment. Even if it hits like within, you know, maybe 20-30 yards of your character, it's still going to be very powerful, and it's pretty damn hard to beat something that does damage while you move, and that's the reason things like Mirage Archer and Cyclone are so good and potent, and I don't think that's really going to change. The fact that it still exists means that you will probably be using it in every bow build, and it's still going to be very freaking good. Similarly, Point Blank Keystone has been seeing use on many bow and other projectile skills for a long time. We felt the damage bonus was too great at close range, forcing a close range playstyle onto a long range weapon. Keystone now provides 30% more projectile damage at close range, down from 50%, tapering to 30% less at long range from 50% less. I think that's a pretty good change overall. I personally fucking hate Point Blank at this point, because as they said, it just straight up forces you into it. You're playing a bow build, and typically you're going to be down the right hand side of the tree, and if you're not, you want to be, because just for taking an extra point or on the passive tree, the keystone, and then being near an enemy, you get 50% more. It's like having a 7th link, and it is just straight up too good to have Point Blank do what it does and completely change your bow playstyle into wanting to be up closer. And for the past few years, that's basically how bows have been, and ranged sort of attacks. You just want to be up close to the enemy to make use of Point Blank, and it doesn't feel like the bow playstyle of run and gun and sort of keep your range and then avoid attacks and that sort of thing. And I have tried to make characters around that instead, and I think it's a lot more fun of a system. So hopefully that's a good change, because 30% more doesn't mean you really have to take it. It's still a pretty nice buff, but there are arguments as to why you should sit back and do damage with a long shot type of things instead of point blank. So I think it's a good change, and you still can get rewarded for doing damage up close and personal with certain projectile skills that might be more melee friendly, something like a Molten Strike. So overall, I think that change is completely fine and even pretty good or justified. We've made adjustments to the damage provided by the Shaper mod that grants cold damage per 10 dexterity and the cold damage bonus on Hyri's Ire. The large amount of added damage from these two items was too great an increase for the too little investment. More item modified changes are noted below. So that's just referring to the fact that most, or at least a lot of the really popular bow type builds and playstyles were based around dexterity stacking and getting cold damage for that dexterity stack, because as they mentioned, multi-modded weapons are so freaking easy to craft, especially with this dexterity stacking business, because all you're looking for is essentially that dexterity stacking mod, and then you build an entire item around that, because everything else doesn't really matter that much. And most builds were just stacking dexterity, getting, hundreds of cold damage for that, and it was forcing a sort of meta for the bow playstyle there. It's a bit boring, a bit stale. So it's good that that's getting changed a bit, and should shake things up a little. We'll see how bad the nerf to that is, as to whether or not it's relevant to completely gut the playstyle, but I think that's totally fine. It was too popular and a bit too strong, and kind of made you shy away from any other method of scaling. Then have bow base types have been adjusted, giving more of a place to unused base types. Assassin bow, sniper bow, recurve now have global crit multi. Spine bow, ivory bow, bone bow now have higher crit chance and attack speed at the cost of damage, and the ranger bow has slightly more base damage. The most powerful uniques using those base types have been adjusted to compensate for the increase in power. The multi is pretty good. It's kind of hard to get a really good multi on a bow or wanding character, so that's a pretty nice change. Higher crit and attack speed is really nice for the bow playstyle, so these sorts of bows I think should be pretty in demand at this point. And then attack speed and the ranger bow slightly more damage. So I think it's pretty good to give more of these bows some viability, because currently Harbinger bow, basically what you're going for, since you want a really high crit and a slightly slower attack speed, or you just go a thicket bow for the really fast, and there's not much in between beyond that. So all these changes seem pretty good and warranted. And then bows and wands can now roll 1 attack speed tier higher than before, of Acclaim, giving 17 to 19 attack speed. Previously 16 attack speed was the max, I think. This makes it possible to have a faster rare wand or bow than before, and increase the difference in power between crafted speed modifiers and rolled speed modifiers, which is pretty good, because rarely were you really going for the attack speed craft, or rather mod, by crafting stuff yourself. You were just slapping it on there with multi-mod and crafting it using the bench, because it was so close in power difference there. So that's a pretty good change, just to give you another something to chase while rolling and crafting. You then have range attack domes have been rebalanced, renamed to ballistas. Passive tree improvements can be seen, have been made, including a new passive tree cluster that includes some move speed and reworked totem nodes. The changes can be seen here, and that is just going to do with all the new ballista changes. And overall, I think ballistas actually look like they're going to be a very solid build type in 3.9 and for endgame and all of that, especially for some of the new passives that come in are really quite good. Something I'm kind of tempted to do myself too, mind you, and I don't really like totems, but it looks fairly solid. Wand base type damage values have been improved, and many of the above changes, as well as new barrage support, will affect wands. We won't be making significant wand-specific changes this league, as we want to do that as part of a more complete archetype package. So wanding changes are still on the horizon. They are still looking at them, but for the most part, they're just giving us some slight buffs here, and Barrage itself as a support will hopefully help Wanding as well. I don't think Wanding's in that bad of a state. It just hasn't really been looked at or given any love recently to make things a little bit interesting, but you can still make Wanders right now and they'll still be pretty fun and fairly successful. So overall, I don't really see an issue here. It just would have been nice to get another new skill or something, but that said, Barrage support will pretty much make a few of the skills feel like new skills anyway, so there it is, Wanding a little bit of a buff. Minions. Overall, the diversity of minion builds as a result of 3.8 review has been positive. There are a few mechanics that are sitting above where we'd like them to be. Following changes have been made. So currently, the big meta in 3.8 for minions was pretty goddamn strong. Minions were very much an easy build to play for everyone, where you could essentially slap in a bunch of minion gems, take some passives on the tree, and just succeed. You didn't really need gear, you didn't really need much skill, and it is a little bit of a problem with how easy that was. So they're saying the weighting of minion modifiers on convoking wands has been lowered, making it harder to roll a great minion wand. Not really a big deal. There's still a lot of good mods there, and I don't think the wand really makes or breaks your character, but fair enough. Minion movement speed increases on the passive tree and Necromancer have been lowered. You could get some pretty goddamn fast minions at the moment, and lowering that probably isn't the worst thing in the world. They do just zoom around, and it looks honestly kind of stupid that that's your army just going faster than most really fast characters that you'd build out there. Both the damage and the buff from the Feeding Frenzy support had their values lowered. As the support was providing too much damage, even if a player didn't want aggressive minions, support was too powerful not to use. Fair enough, just a slight nerf to Feeding Frenzy, which just about every minion build would have been using. Raised zombies had too much damage and life for a small investment. They've been lowered in power slightly in several ways. Lower base damage, lower area on slam, no life multiplier per gem level, and a longer slam cooldown. That's all pretty fair enough. Zombies are very strong. The amount of life you can get on a zombie for tankiness, or even for using some shenanigans for exploding minions or damage over time from the minions, stuff like that, was pretty damn high. So having that go down a bit is fine. Zombies did deal quite a bit of damage, so reducing their damage I think is fine. Don't know about the lower area on slam. I never really saw too much of a area imbalance there. And a longer slam cooldown. Yeah, I mean, it's fair. It's all pretty justified, I suppose. We felt Raised Spectre was too easy to get third Spectre at gem level 21, especially with Necromancer's Unnatural Strength passive. The third Spectre is now granted at gem level 25, giving a more challenging threshold for characters to strive for. That's going to be a kind of a big deal because getting a third Spectre is pretty big for a build, and gem level 21 obviously very easy to get. Level 25 quite a bit harder to get, quite a bit more investment. Just means there's going to be, I suppose, more of a min-max and more of a chase in your gearing and building of the character, which really isn't that bad a thing, because you do want a sense of progression in your end game as opposed to just getting some of your passives, getting to a certain level and going done. So it's not really too bad, and certainly not the end of the world getting to level 25 with the way a lot of the minion stuff is. Non-damaging elements. Chill, shock, and freeze are mechanics intended to give identity to elements, but have been falling short of this goal. To reliably apply a non-damaging element to an endgame boss, either a huge damage hit would need to have been applied, or more likely a guaranteed effect, like chilled, shocked ground, or the elementalist beacon of ruined, would be used. For attack characters, there are almost no options to reliably apply these effects. We plan to change that. Except, of course, our new best friend Skitterbots, which most builds could easily justify, and really did justify. We've greatly changed the calculation for chill and shock. Now applying a 5% chill only requires you to deal 0.4% of a target's life, down from 1.67. A 10% chill requires you to deal 1.8% of a target's life, while applying a full force 30% chill requires you to deal 28%. This makes any reasonable hit of an element much more capable of applying a chill or a shock without massively weakening tougher enemies. It also means that chill effect and shock effect are much more useful, as it'll be much easier to turn 10% chill on a boss into a 20% chill using 100% increased chill effect rather than having to deal 460% more damage. That does seem like a pretty nice change. Overall, you will be chilling things a lot more this way. That's not a very high threshold to have to hit. The kind of problem with chill I've always had, or I have right now, is that you get used to certain boss fights and certain mechanics based off of their default speed. You slow them down by 10%, 20%, and all of a sudden you are adjusting to completely different mechanics, and you will miss your timings quite a lot of the time. So it's something you're going to have to get used to if you do start to chill things quite often, that things are going to be slower and their timings are going to be way off. But it is definitely a very powerful tool, and shocking currently is actually pretty common. I'm not too sure why they're saying that there hasn't been much shock identity. I guess because it's just auto-applied from certain mechanics. Don't know. Because of these changes, attack skills dealing cold or lightning damage will be able to apply these effects on bosses much more easily, but will also benefit from investment. Near the ranger starting area on the passive tree, we've added a new shock and lightning cluster, a new ignite cluster, and have made improvements to the flash freeze cluster. That's pretty good. Flash freeze is currently a pretty bad cluster, definitely needs some improvement, and some new clusters early on. Especially if they do some fancy things, are going to be just pretty damn nice to take. In addition to these changes, we've made non-damaging ailments to care about an ailment threshold when applying an effect instead of the target's maximum life. For many monsters, the ailment threshold and monster's life will be the same, but very high health targets like map bosses and endgame bosses will now have a significantly lower ailment threshold than they do life. This should make shocking or chilling Shaper much easier, as you'll be applying the effect as if they had approximately half the life they have now. So once again, pretty good change that you will actually be able to shock and chill enemies reliably based off of your attacks and not just guaranteed effects. Chill and shock now have a minimum effect of 5%, up from 1%. This is because this value is much easier to apply, so having insignificantly small chills and shocks don't justify the visual signaling. So at least 5% if you're critting with your teeny tiny shocks or lightning damage seems pretty good. We've lowered the base shock effect and chill effect of some mechanics that have a guaranteed value. Shock ground now is a minimum of 15%, which will affect similar mechanics like Skitterbots, RIP, Necromancer's Corpse Pact, and Storm's Gift. 15% shock off Skitterbots, still pretty damn good. A lot of the reason you're using them is to just activate other things that help with the shock, like impulses, so that won't really change, and Skitterbots sound pretty good still. 15% is still a nice little damage buff if you have nothing else for your build with that reservation anyway. Freeze hasn't had its duration calculation change, but will be applied against the lower ailment threshold. Scorch, Brittle, and Sap have had their value calculations updated to be similar to Chill and Shock's new value calculations. These are based off of like a few little niche items that no one really uses as far as I'm concerned, so it's kind of whatever. Monster resistances, armor, and life. As the average character's damage has grown over time, we're going to be incrementally updating monster defenses to be more challenging. This league, we're looking at monster life, resistance, and armor. We've done a pass over the resistances of all monsters in the game. Monster resists should now be far more consistent. In general, monsters have more resist than before, in particular bosses. A regular map boss now has 40% Ellie, up from 30, 25 Chaos, up from 15. Very strong boss like Shaper now has 50 resist, up from 40, and 30 Chaos, up from 25. So a lot of characters already stack a lot of elemental penetration, or some things like Inquisitor just ignore it altogether. That won't really change anything for those. The Chaos Resist thing from 15 to 25 is going to be a little annoying because most builds don't have any like Chaos penetration or Chaos resistance being applied to, or negative Chaos resist being applied to enemies. So that will hit the characters pretty hard and make a cultist just a little bit nicer, but overall completely justified changes as bosses are pretty freaking easy at the moment. Monster armor has been largely irrelevant beyond a very low level for a long time, reducing reasonable physical damage hits by almost nothing. To mirror the resistance changes in monsters, we're updating monster armor growth to be something that noticeably impacts physical builds, physical damage characters when fighting highly armored monsters. So currently bleed builds are pretty strong, though not very seen out in the wild or used all that much. It does take a bit of ramp to get there. I think this won't really make too much of a difference to endgame boss fights for bleed or impale, which is a very strong way of scaling physical damage. And then for builds that are most affected by this change, we'll be adding a new stat you can invest in that lets hits bypass an amount of physical damage reduction on enemies. So that's a pretty big change to be able to counter it anyway. This stat is enemies have minus total physical damage reduction against your hits. This can't reduce physical damage reduction below 0, unlike resistance penetration stats. This will be found on various weapon notables on the passive tree, as well as a few small clusters and new influence modifiers. The stat would also apply to physical damage reduction from other sources like endurance charges and map modifiers. And honestly, this is pretty fucking awesome. I hate these two map mods. Endurance charges, not as much, but the physical damage reduction modifier on map mods when you're a pure phys character is so awful that it just feels unfair because there's no way to get around it. And now there is, so that's actually a really nice change. And most characters that are full phys should invest in a little bit of this by default just by picking up their weapon notables. Impale is significantly affected by the higher armor values because of how its damage down small hits. Impale isn't directly affected by your modifier, so it doesn't benefit from the stat mentioned above. Instead, some Impale passives and Impale Sport will cause Impales applied to give monsters -% to total physical damage reduction against Impale. This effect doesn't stack for each Impale applied. These bonuses will usually have higher values than the generic hit reduction found on the tree. So there are ways to counter this new stuff with some passives anyway, and Impale probably should be fine anyway. The life of all unique monsters in the game has been increased by 10%. That's not terribly significant, but hey, it's a start, right? On top of this, we've reevaluated the life of all bosses in the campaign, with some of them getting considerable life buffs to bring them in line with the health of other campaign bosses. Some of these bosses, particularly early on, have had existing skills improved or new skills added in order to make these encounters more challenging. That is totally fine. A lot of the bosses out there right now are kind of a joke and don't even exist, aren't really even bosses. They're just something to click on at the end of a map. And then map boss life has been greatly increased at the highest tier of maps, now scales much more linearly towards higher tiers rather than jumping suddenly at tier 16. Notable bosses like the Elder now have significantly more life, as they now only fought in late map progression. Special bosses like Atsiri have had their life adjusted to match new boss life progression. Non-boss monsters in maps have had their life increased to a lesser degree. I think that's all a pretty good change. Something I've always been a little confused about is the big jump to tier 16. Like, you're just going along nicely from tier 1 to 15 and things get slightly harder, slightly challenging, and then all of a sudden you have to just face that. And it does feel a bit weird that there's no real sense of progression there. You got no idea how your character was doing, and then all of a sudden you get just beat to shit by something that's much tougher. Obviously not as much recently because we've been overpowering the tier 15 and then especially the tier 16 stuff. So that's a good change, and overall most bosses being up to tier 15 a lot tougher, a lot tankier, and an actual boss fight is a good thing. It's a fun thing to do, to go across like Malachi in a core map and have him put up a bit of a fight and be a bit of a challenge, as opposed to just an instant one-shot, which is what most of these bosses are. So I'm pretty happy with this change personally. Leveling. Certain skills in sports were too prevalent when leveling, allowing players leveling new characters to advance too quickly while not rewarding players using skills appropriate to their final build. Orbistorm's Lightning Spire Trap, Onslaught Sports, Smoke Mine, Stormblast Mine are being reduced in power at lower levels, but will be around as effective late game. And that is totally fine, I think. Yeah, some of these are just going to be way too strong and help you level too fast, and I do personally believe in trying to be your build while leveling and going towards the skills you're going to be using, as opposed to using the real cheesy, easy leveling stuff and then swapping into your late game build later. This has kind of always been an issue though. There's always something really good to level with that's better than everything else, and it always gets kind of toned down eventually once the top racers and the top PoE players figure out what that is. So is what it is. There'll probably still be something pretty busted to level with. Maybe even some of this stuff will still be pretty damn good. But honestly, the speed at which some people can get through the current content right now is pretty disgusting. We're down to 2-hour Act 10 clears. That's just filthy, but they are amazing players, so, you know, credit where credit is due. Modifier adjustments. As Elder and Shaper items will now be harder to obtain and a large number of new mods have been added to the new Influence mod pools, we've taken this opportunity to go back and reevaluate the power of various mods that have been added over the years through the Elder Shaper Influence mod pool, Fossil mod pool, as well as the Veiled mod pool. The goal of these changes is to have fewer must-have modifiers that outclass all other mod alternatives, and not have the Shaper Elder Influence mod pools and Multicraft mod items completely outclass the new influence types on some slots. Here are some of the changes made. Power has been lowered on some of the more impactful modifiers like cold damage per 10 dexterity on bows and elemental damage as extra chaos. That's definitely totally fine. They are very strong, very busted mods at the moment. Some modifiers no longer appear on Shaper or Elder items, like the increased physical damage and socketed gems supported by modifiers on two-handed weapons, which is a bit of a kick in the nuts. We're talking about supported by cast on crit, which I love for my exquisite blade. We're talking about supported by fortify, maybe supported by endurance, charge on stun, endurance, that. We're talking about supported by power charge on crit, and yeah, look, it's totally justifiable. It sucks, but the point is, most of the weapons we've been playing with, especially two-handers in the past year or so, has just been get a weapon, craft that one stat, that one supported by stat, and then multi-mod around it. It's fucking bullshit, right? I mean, you get a one mod exquisite blade and then multi-mod around it, and you got yourself better than a Starforge that is supposed to be end game amazing weapon, but it gets crushed by just one modded weapons, and it does feel kind of bad. Even though it feels really good being overpowered, it felt bad going into that meta and being a slave to that crafting system. So I don't see this as a bad thing personally. It's just going to be harder to be overpowered. The can have multiple crafted modifiers mod has been changed, now granting can have up to 3 crafted modifiers. Multi-mod crafting an item was proving too powerful for too low a cost compared with rolling an item of relative power. Keeping an eye on the modifier to see if further changes are required. And that's pretty justified too. In many of my characters, I could easily have a multi-modded item in every slot, because more often than not, it'll be better than what I'd have available otherwise. This won't change things too much, I don't think. Just it'll tone down a few of the weapons you're using out there to not be quite as powerful. But in many other cases, in plenty of slots, you're looking for something to fill out that 4th slot anyway. So it doesn't really matter. This won't change a lot of those items, but in some cases it will make things just slightly weaker. And overall, yeah, it makes sense. Multi-modding is pretty damn powerful, and just become too much of the meta recently, making crafting a bit too easy. And then we've got some few other adjustments, other balance adjustments. Arc, Soul Rend, Molten Strike, Shattering Steel, Lancing Steel, Venom, Gyre, and more have been buffed. This is a buff. Sounds good. All of these things could definitely use buffs. I've made builds around all of these fairly recently. Arc, I'm not sure really needs a buff. I know everyone's like, yay, Arc buff. The only issue is the bouncing and the chains are a little weak at the moment, just the range. Overall though, it's still a fucking strong skill and still very good in cast on crit setups. If it gets much better, holy shit, you're going to put it in all your setups once again. Icicle Mine projectiles are now limited range, meaning they won't travel as far by default, and their projectile distance can be modified by projectile speed. It looked like they had insane amounts of damage. Don't know if the projectile speed here being changed by default is really going to change anything. I didn't play any mines this league, but that's because it looked busted and everyone was like, hey, it's super busted. And I don't find much challenge in that. Skill enchantments that grant area effect now grant higher values for the majority of cases. Most of them will grant 16/24 increased area effect. That's pretty cool because the current area enchants I think at 12%, and it's really meaningless and not something you go for. Up to 24% is something you may actually pick as a sort of alternative to anything else. And then Fortify and the buff from the Unshattering will now give less damage taken rather than reduced damage taken, preventing cases where players were close to reaching 100% reduced damage taken. And I think that's totally fine. That's not really a nerf in any way, shape, or form to most of us, and won't really affect us in most ways. And once again, it won't really kill off melee or anything like the stuff that I've read. I'm not too sure what's happening now as I think about it. I have clicked on Reddit a few times. I haven't, since this has come out, since I haven't really looked at it until now. And yeah, people are concerned about melee nerfs, and I don't really see it. I mean, by proxy, maybe some of the two-handed stuff. The Fortify, I don't see how that really changes anything for most people. And overall, like Impale, Fizz, been slightly adjusted, but then fixed. So the investment should cancel out. Overall, stuff's too strong anyway. Yeah, I don't see any problem with any of this. It all seems kind of fine and completely justified. If you step back and take a think about it, surely you'd agree that a lot of these mods are way too easy to get, and a lot of these multi-modded items are a bit too stupid to be using. So I don't know, it all seems pretty good to me. We'll have to wait and see with the patch notes later on tonight, or they're coming out soon, but I'll be doing a usual drunk patch note reading stream in something like 12 hours from this video, something like that, and it should be fun, and we have to wait and see what other changes lie before us. So that's the balance manifesto thing from me, the audiobook. Sorry it was so long. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.